Welcome to the GovComms podcast, bringing you the latest insights and innovations from experts and thought leaders around the globe in government communication. Now, here is your host, David Pembroke.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to GovComms, the podcast that examines the practice of content communication in government and the public sector. My name is David Pembroke. Today, we're joined by Dr. Melanie BAGG, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Youth Science Forum here in Australia. Dr. BAGG is a PhD qualified medical research scientist and award-winning professional science communicator. Currently, she is the CEO of the National Youth Science Forum, where she's focused on delivering transformative youth-led experiences for young Australians to encourage lifelong participation in science, technology, engineering and maths. She is a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and having experience in higher education, media and the not-for-profit sectors. Melanie has 15 years of experience and expertise in STEM management, fundraising, science communication, outreach, publishing, media, for the not-for-profit sector and higher education. And she joins me in the studio. Dr. BAGG, welcome to GovComms.
Thank you for having me.
You also did some really interesting work, I think, with the Academy of Science here in Canberra. And we will come to that. But we were just chatting and we come to you, this will be, and I'm sure in the next week or so, will still be a topic, but the coronavirus. And we were just having a conversation there about communication around these types of issues. As a science communicator, certainly, you know, we shook hands when we came in, and then the most recent thing is don't shake hands with people. So what are your views on how it's sort of jumped the fence and it's out and moving and everyone's having an opinion? There's all sorts of theories going. As a science communicator, how do you look upon issues like coronavirus?
Thanks, David. Look, as a science communicator, the thing that we try to do with any topic that is of interest to the public, whether that's a medical topic or something else that's particularly in the news, is to bring it back to the evidence and the basics. And that's one of the things that I think is so important with a topic like coronavirus, because as people get out there and spread sometimes misinformation, people get really scared. So one of the things I've spent a lot of time on ABC doing is being a medical science mythbuster. And what we do with that is actually taking the papers and the evidence and evidence from government departments and the actual evidence and then trying to craft that in a way that general public can understand. And so with something like coronavirus, I think at this stage the Australian landscape, we've done a really good job of trying to inform people but keep them relatively calm. But what you see around the world is a lot of people in major panic. Some of the messaging that seems to be spreading out there can really elicit huge panic and probably misinformation. As you were saying, you went to a hairdresser this morning and they were telling you a great story about how this all began. And this is the concern that when people are left to communicate the science amongst their own little echo groups and their interest groups, that some very fanciful stories get out. And we've seen this have long-term health effects in other areas. So measles, mumps, rubella vaccine is probably one of the most historically famous examples of where a scientist actually did the wrong thing and misreported about that. And that's had an impact on the area for many, many decades. And so now what we have is still pockets of the community who are really scared of that vaccination, that they think it could actually have autistic effects on the child. We know that's not true. But it's really important to have official science communicators who go and read the evidence and communicate that in all sorts of forums, and whether that's in the government, whether that's in academia, in media, in not-for-profits like the Academy of Science, which we were mentioning before. It's absolutely essential we have that evidence base before we start the communication expertise.
Sure, but how do you stop the misinformation? How do you challenge the misinformation effectively so as that you can knock it over? Because interesting, you bring up that vaccination around measles, mumps, rubella, because it still runs to this day. That there are, every so often it sort of comes back up, and there's another sort of campaign that rolls behind it.
Yes.
Misinformed.
Yes. I think the best thing you can do is to make sure you supply ample evidence-based information and actually have fresh new campaigns. Putting the correct information out there just once usually isn't enough. It's a matter of putting it out there multiple times, making sure you're getting maximum reach. So in that example, it's important that on social media that there are evidence-based groups constantly promoting the real results of that and what really is the case.
But are they resourced for that? And do they have the capability to be able to be a media company on behalf of their credible organisation?
Well, some do and some don't. So you're right. So it's very important that we work with media and we work with government agencies to try and make sure that everybody is working together. And you do see that. It's actually, Australia's a really good example of where you have the experts from a not-for-profit area or an interest group working with, for example, ABC to go in there and talk to them about it, or the Department of Health will actually make sure that there are appropriate campaigns going out that are evidence-based, so they're incorporating all of those people. So I guess what I'm saying is that it has to be multiple players, but at the end of the day it has to have the evidence base, and it needs to be not just a one approach, to conquer misinformation. The other thing we see is when somebody is very strongly opposed to a view, whether that's evidence-based or not, it's very hard to change their mind. It can happen, but it's probably not going to be your best bet. It's more helpful to actually inform the people who are out there going, which information should I trust? So if you get enough of the credible organisations and credible media out there, I think you've got a better chance of actually.
Is it getting worse because of the amount that people are consuming content on their phones, the amount of time that's being spent on phones? The hysteria perhaps is getting worse?
I think it's really easy for people to get very focused on their echo chamber, on their devices with certain social media platforms. And by that, you'll find members of the community are sharing certain information amongst their group, and they're not necessarily looking broadly for that information. When you're talking to a media outlet, you're usually hoping that there's lots of different views coming forward, different approaches to it, different evidence presented. But in social media, we're our own curators. So if we don't look broadly, we could be getting information that's wrong. The other thing that really concerns me is how regularly information can be put out there that looks legitimate. And I've seen excellent examples of this myself, where it actually looks like a scientific paper or evidence is provided to an argument, but it's actually, if you read closer and you're a science communicator, you can see that the actual paper that they've used to justify that story was not the correct paper, or that someone's misinterpreted it. Sometimes somebody just doesn't have the expertise to know that that paper on the flu doesn't apply to that paper on a different vaccine. And so that's the sort of
scenario. Do you see that fake news a lot in science communication?
It was one of the reasons why I think science communication has become such an important area to specialise in, because that was, and still is, out there, quite a lot of misinformation about science via fake news. However, I'm pleased to report that I think a lot of organisations are really working to combat that. Now, it doesn't stop it coming out, but it means that there's more chance that you're going to see credible organisations like the CSIRO or the Academy of Science out there saying, well, here's the facts, and this is what you can take away from this.
So more broadly, we'll leave coronavirus and hopefully it'll get under control and it will be normalised as any other sort of virus, and hopefully we will all return to normal life, and the aisles and the shelves of the supermarkets will be returned to normal. But let's hope it can be brought under control. But listen, your career in science communication, we were on a panel a few months ago, and we had a nice little chat before we got started. And it's quite as you were a medical research scientist, but you sort of moved elsewhere through science communication, now up to a role of CEO. So perhaps if you can give us the broad view of science communication and where it is at the moment and the capability, and how are we How are we going at the moment in terms of communicating effectively in science?
Yeah, well, look, when I set out on the pathway to become a science communicator, at that point, no one really knew what a science communicator was. I was very lucky to have someone who had spent many years communicating science on a TV show take me under his wing. And when I said, oh, I want to be more involved in communication, I thought lecturing was where I'd be heading.
Right.
He said, why don't you try actually going out and becoming a science communicator? That could be in the media, that could be at a university. In the end, my first job I did get was at a university specialising in outreach. So both on communicating all the science that we were doing in all different areas, but also running events and actually engaging students with the science. And that's sort of where I have come back to now with the National Youth Science Forum. We don't only communicate the science that's out there, we also provide transformative experiences so the students can come in and have a go at that science that they're hearing about and we're communicating. Now, fast forward to 15 years into my career, when you say you're a science communicator, people don't even blink. It's a well-recognised, well-known profession. What I'm excited about is you're seeing it really expand into lots of different areas. So you have science communicators in most universities and most academic organisations. Some of them are very specialised in their area and some of them are more broad. Like I went into all sciences and I found that fascinating because one day I'd be talking about agriculture, the next day I'm talking about physics. And then, of course, medical science was my underlying passion. So that's really exciting. But then you see people in government departments, the policies that we see passed is so important to have people working with the scientists, working out, okay, how can we best communicate this, both for our decision makers as well as the public? That's such a crucial role. And, then we see people in not-for-profits like ours that are part of that, presenting the science and engaging future generations in the science. So I think there's lots of different opportunities now, and I think it's really going in the right direction in that we're working in a beautiful unit with the scientists who have the evidence base and making sure that we help them with the communication skills to actually make sure that's getting to the right audiences, and then the organisation supporting all of that to make sure that people are finding the right information out at the right time.
What are the keys to being a good science communicator?
So for me, it all comes back to evidence. So you must make sure that you're not going out and talking about an area outside of your field, or if you are, you need to qualify that. I am a science commentator, so I qualify that when I'm on radio and they've asked me to talk about physics or something that I do not have my PhD in. It's fine to do that, but you need to do your homework. You need to have read widely in that area. And sometimes if you don't feel like you are experienced enough in that area, you really should pass on that opportunity. So that's number one. Number two is actually understanding why you're communicating. And this is one of the things I think so many people get wrong, and where you and I really bonded in that session we were in, is audience. So many communicators out there have a message to tell, but to be a good science communicator, you really have to identify exactly who are you trying to reach, where are they, and depending on where you're reaching them, how do you have to package your content that's unique.
So in terms of the skills around the scientists and the science communication, are the skills the same as any other sort of communication skills that you would work with?
To an extent, so that later bit of the audience and making sure that you're packaging it in the correct way. In my career, I've learnt all of that from the marketing communications world. But the science specialisation bit is where science communicators can offer something very different. Because when you're talking to a Nobel Prize winning physicist, for example, or somebody who has very deep technical detail, you have to be really careful that information is being appropriately, first of all, translated and then communicated. And so that requires lots of stages of fact-checking and making sure that, you're not just going off with this story, or we get fake news like we were talking about.
But there's also that challenge, isn't there, of when you're working with the scientists who have such deep knowledge and then getting that translation piece, particularly when you're going out to the community, where you're taking a piece of highly technical information and trying to put it into a form that the man or woman on the street can say, oh, okay, I understand what that's about. So How do you develop those skills, those translation skills?
Yeah, so look, I think it's often a multi-step process depending on how detailed the information is. But the thing you learn as a more experienced science communicator is not to be afraid of really distilling that down to a simple message.
Yep.
The number one thing is to go back to the scientist or go back to an evidence-based body who is a speciality in that, and to make sure that the way you have translated that and the way you've simplified that for general messaging, that you haven't got anything wrong. And so for some areas that's very simple and very easy, but other areas when you've got many different factors, or it could have a really significant impact and result in harm to a group of people or a big behavioural change, it is very important that science communicators do their due diligence and get that fact checking done. But the thing is, they shouldn't just go, I can't distill it down because,
Yes.
It's complex. That's exactly what we need to do, but it's not making it dumber in any way. It's actually making it more focused, but in a way that people can understand and relate it to their own life.
It sounds time consuming to be able to assemble that simple story. How do you manage that complexity in a time poor environment where people are looking to move faster and faster and faster? How do you balance the needs?
Well, especially from my experience in the social media world, that's probably one of the times where it comes in most, importantly, is when you're trying to turn around a breaking news story within half an hour or an hour. Then it is number of people. So you really have to have a team of people who all have their position to play in that.
Yep.
So one will be trying to distill it down, the others will be starting to make the parts of the video or, bedding down the communication package. And then you need a group of people totally committed to fact-checking that and fact-checking that fast. So it really is a team sport. It's something that everybody has to come together and actually make sure, right, that's our deadline, that's where we're going to. And sometimes there's things that aren't so important, whether, it's really making sure that the important things are ticked off and that bit is accurate. The other thing that's very important to realise with any of this science communication is over time science changes. So something we know today, in a year's time, it can be very different. So it's very important that we all start going back and looking at previous, articles and work we've done, if they're still in the public domain, that we're not accidentally spreading misinformation because we've done something years ago and now the science has changed. Some areas that moves a lot quicker than others.
Now, a couple of case studies. I was fascinated when we were on that panel that you were talking about the Academy here in Canberra, Academy of Science, where you were engaged as essentially the communications and engagement director of the Institute. You came in with a view, came in with a plan. How about you tell us that story about how you went about building the presence of the Academy?
Sure. Well, look, when I joined the Academy, one of their biggest aims was to engage the unengaged. So the Academy of Science is a fantastic organisation and they have really the brains trust of Australian science there. But when I came in, we felt like they were talking to themselves or to
and they probably were.
Yeah, and to very senior policymakers.
Right.
So when I first come in, we did a few surveys and said to the general public, well, do you know who we are? And really the brand recognition was fairly low. So the aim was to make sure that we were engaging the unengaged with science and that we were improving the science literacy. So with all the fantastic work the Academy was doing and still does today, it was about making sure that that got translated to a level that the mums, the dads, the grandparents, everybody can understand, and not just in Australia, but internationally.
Now, just to jump in there, a survey you started with. So you started with evidence. How much evidence, how big was that survey, given that the unengaged is a fairly imagine a fairly large group?
Look, this one was pretty informal focus group sort of survey and focus group, a combination. So we went out there and we just asked a whole range of different people, both in Australia, and we had some of our colleagues overseas who asked people overseas. We knew that probably it wasn't very well recognised necessarily amongst the public. It was very well recognised against other leading science organisations. So it wasn't that hard to work it out. The other thing is on our Facebook page, only 9,000 people were following the Academy. So we looked at Facebook as where were the unengaged people. We felt that there were a lot of people on Facebook that were there not for getting their science information. They were there for sharing pictures of their kids and doing other things. So it seemed like a really good platform to try that out and say, okay, how will we go here if we have a targeted campaign to engage these people with science information?
Mm-hmm. And that's what you did, I imagine.
That is what we did, and
So
still doing it today.
Facebook-led?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And that was the big insight that came out of that survey, was that that was the channel where they were spending most time, the unengaged, and therefore that's where you're going to put your efforts?
Yeah, not just the survey, but the social media statistics. You know, we could very clearly see where the biggest audiences were, and we could also see where we had the biggest chance to make an impact. Now, the Academy has gone on to definitely diversify that strategy, but Facebook, when I was there, was the first step of that. Mm-hmm. And it worked. You know, we went from 9,000 people following the Academy to within a year we were well over the 1 million people following and engaging with those videos, with that content. And they weren't, the views were fantastic, some of the views that we were seeing on some of these topics, but also the engagement, so the type of comments that we were seeing. So we did a very big vaccination campaign with the Department of Health while I was there, and we saw community change. We saw people commenting on the page saying, thank you for explaining the science behind that. I feel much more comfortable now with my decision. Or would go to a meeting and someone would say, I took my kids to get that jab because, you know, I watched the video, it helped me understand what it was all about and why it was important. And to me, that's what I loved as a science communicator, was seeing that we could establish this fantastic communication unit, but it actually helped people with their literacy around the science, their understanding of, you know, things going on. And it meant that communities that otherwise might have felt like they can't access that science could. I come from a very small country town in South Australia, and up until that project, not many of them really ever followed science. But I guess because of my connection to that town and also, you know, the great content we were putting out, that whole town is still following the Academy and loves what they're doing. And the comments that I've had there about how it's helped them understand environmental issues, how it's helped them understand health issues, and also where to get accurate information. You know, that's what we're trying to do when we do something like that, is to actually empower people, not just to believe everything that you hear, but to, well, how do I find out some more information about that and make my own mind up?
Okay. Now, it's easy just to probably let that slip, but you said 9,000 to 1 million. Now, that's just extraordinary. How did you go about deciding what parts of science you would focus on in terms of the editorial and the story? And then how did you decide whether it was a post, or was animation, or it was a infographic, or it was a video? Give us some insights into your editorial planning behind, you know, building this vast audience.
Well, obviously, we were based within the Australian Academy of Science, so the direction of the fellowship and the direction of the CEO of the Academy was very important. They had a number of topics that they were creating 10-year plans on. Right. This is a 10-year plan for science, or they'd have an area that they had got the best scientists in the country to work on. So that had some level to do with content.
So you're connecting back up to the wider...
Yes, the policy.
The policy of the organisation.
Yes.
So you sort of linked up to the mothership, so to speak, in terms of giving you guardrails as to where you could play and not play.
Our framing.
Yeah.
However, we also had a lot of scope to explore science for the love of science. So, you know, we had a fellow who was going over to Africa and taking the most beautiful photos. And so then we get animal behavioural experts to help us build a story behind this beautiful footage that he'd bring back. Okay. And so that also humanised scientists.
And what was his role? He was a scientist taking photos.
He was a scientist, yeah. So his
so
area was geology.
Yeah.
Yep. His area was geology. He would go over to Africa and he loves photography. Yep. Now, what that meant is more people got to know him as a scientist. They got to know what he had done in his actual career, and everybody just loved the content that he created. But the big part that we added was what is beyond just this pretty photo, this piece of video content, this infographic.
And it was the people, though, that by what you're saying, excuse me, but what you're saying is it was the people
that was
behind the content that really helped as well, because they started to become known and became personal. And so it was, okay, this is this wonderful person who is out there doing this work, and isn't it great to know that this is what that image comes to represent?
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, that's...
Yeah, so look, and
so they're all rock stars now, are they, around the Academy of Science?
Well, look, they're still doing fantastic work on that. And just the other day, I saw a video that they had they'd created. So they give a lot of young emerging researchers this sort of opportunity at the Academy too. So I would suggest that you get the CEO and the Director of Comms there to come in and tell you where they've taken that now.
Yeah, loved it.
Because it really is fantastic. And I'm so proud to sit back and watch, where they're growing it to, and that it keeps on going that direction. But in terms of content and what content, really we saw video at the time as a key strategy, because people have short attention spans on social media. If you haven't grabbed them within a few seconds on something like Facebook, then it's not going to do it. Photos, videos tend to be the quickest and easiest way to reach mass audiences. Having said that, it's very important to have more grit behind any of that. So what I liked about what we were doing there was we'd have, the video or the photo part of the content package, but we'd also have a lovely 500-word article to explain a bit deeper science and connect them through to, well, here's the paper on that if you actually want to go and read the scientific paper.
And where was that content housed? Was that on the platform, say the Facebook platform, or was that back at your website where you were sending people back to your sort of website to, if they wanted to know more?
Yeah, so the Academy has it all on their website,
right.
But it was also, if people wanted to find it on Facebook, it was possible, but it was the library of all the content is certainly through the website.
Yeah.
And so that's the other thing. Websites, I think, still play a very important, valuable role for making sure that you've got this great reserve of information and the full story. But they're not going to be the place where, in my opinion, the unengaged people are just going to, go on Google, find your website and go in and see that piece of content. So to me, it's got to be putting it out more widely, making it really entertaining and almost like credible clickbait. They want to click on it, but that it's going to lead back to a good source. Yeah. So that's
now
what
again,
we're trying to do.
9,000 to 1 million, and you've given us a bit of an idea as the strategic sort of pathway to that. But then how did you operationalise that? How many people did you have? And I think one of the great insights you've just given us is something that I talk about a lot, is this notion of it's not just the comms team. If you make the team bigger and you look around and look at everybody and think, well, they actually could all potentially be contributors, which is obviously a key part of what you did and probably gave them skills, wider than just the central comms team. But there had to be a sort of core team, I'm sure, sitting there. Yeah. What did that look like? What sort of skills and...
Yeah, so the whole comms team at the time I was there was around 20 people, but directly on this project was probably about 16 or 17. So you had video producers, you had writers, you had people who were graphic experts as well. So, and then you had the people that would go off to fact check everything and communicate. But the wider team was very important. So the impact of the other teams within the Academy, so the policy team, the sort of guidance from the council of the Academy and the fellows themselves. So they had over 500 fellows who were the most rich source of content. They're still going through all that content. It will be a content absolute treasure box for years to come.
Yeah. But again, I think the key insight there is then connecting everybody up to the task, but also then celebrating with everybody when the successes come to say, hey, look how this just performed. Here's a case study of XYZ fellow who did X, Y, and Z, and look what happened. And then build that enthusiasm within the team, which obviously you clearly did, and then people joined up to the success. So that knowledge and that success, you've now moved into a new role. you're the CEO of the National Youth Science Forum. How have you taken that learning into the Youth Forum to help them to achieve their objectives?
Sure. Well, look, when you work with such a vibrant team, as I did there, you get a lot of management skills for a team, but also how you work with your broader stakeholders. So at the National Youth Science Forum, our broader stakeholders include Rotary, so we get huge amounts of support from Rotarians all around the country. They're one of the reasons why we can find students in small rural country towns and give them the opportunity to come to Canberra or Brisbane and experience the National Youth Science Forum for 2 weeks. And so I guess that learning I can apply in a slightly different way in my role as CEO, and again bring the team together, make sure that everyone from the board to our stakeholders such as Rotary to our partners, which our partners, some of them are financial but a lot of them are also in kind, so they are the ones who supply us with the science experience or come out and actually speak to the students about the latest science. And then the other part of that is thinking about, so every year we're curating these amazing science experiences. How do we decide on the science that goes into them? What should be the focuses? And again, that comes down to those relationships and understanding, okay, so what's this academy doing? What's CSIRO doing? What are some of the other key stakeholders, in Australia? What are their priorities? What's the government's priorities? And what should we be making sure that these students are aware of in terms of future jobs, in terms of the direction that they're taking their STEM learnings in? Because some of them, don't go on to science, but they go into allied areas such as law or policy. But we see about 90% of these actually go into STEM. So that's...
So in terms now of your role as CEO, obviously coming out of that communications content role, how much of a part of it is it now of your day-to-day role?
Look, the actual the communications, as in doing all the planning for social and for our other content, I have an awareness of it, but I leave that to the team that are doing it. But obviously, shape it as the CEO of what your passion is, and they know my passion is to engage the engaged, to reach people who may not be able to participate.
Okay, so it's the same
science.
mission. You're moving it just into another area.
And we collaborate with the Academy. The Academy and us are close collaborators. So to me, it's a collaborative approach. I think everybody in Australia needs to be working together with the government, and we do, to actually make sure that more people have access to STEM, that they really understand where they can go with it and what sort of study opportunities are there for them, study and work in the future. So, so look, it's a different role. Suddenly, you're dealing with a lot more than just the comms. But for our organisations, comms is very important. If we don't communicate what we're doing properly, the students don't get the experience that they have signed up for, and also they don't necessarily know about the experience. So making sure they know that applications are about to open in March, we need to be good at communicating, in that way as well.
So more broadly, and a final question, but looking out in 5 years' time and understanding where you've come from through this content communication journey, where do you see it going? Where do you see the innovation coming, and not only innovation in terms of the way people are receiving and consuming content, but how organisations such as the National Youth Science Forum will produce and distribute information?
Look, I think it's an interesting question, and I don't think you can entirely predict this. But an area I think is very fascinating is how people talk within their own groups. So we have 12,000 alumni at the National Youth Science Forum, and I'm very interested in how we can make sure that the comms piece for them, so the closed Facebook groups, for example, the sort of events and activities and experiences that we expose those alumni to, how that can support them in their lifelong science learning journey. So that's an area I think we'll see communication become more nuanced. At the moment, we've been looking at mass communication and how do we get as many people to click on this video as we can, and how do we, make sure we're educating a huge number of people, and I don't think that will go away. But what I think we will see is more communicators focusing on those very niche areas. So how do I look after this 12,000 Brains Trust for NYSF
Sure.
who have come through the program and are now in senior, government, science roles, professorships around the country? How do we make sure that we are doing a comms piece for them?
Sure.
And
that engagement piece with them is to then engage them, but then to activate them and their influence that they now have.
Exactly,
Yeah,
and to
okay.
make sure that then they are, I guess, appropriately, being, given the resources and the things that they need to go out and do that more broadly, especially with the younger generation, which is what we're interested in. So to make sure that more students in school are actually getting, that hands-on science experience or meeting that scientist that changes their path.
But it's also that challenge, isn't it? And the journey, as they call it, to personalisation, that, we're now dealing with an audience of one.
Yes.
People are now thinking, okay, well, how is this relevant to me?
Yeah.
Which, again, is a challenge, because how do we then make the most of the data that we can to understand the audiences, and then how do we make the most of the technology in order to, to achieve that personalisation that will resonate, that will, capture people's time and attention.
Yeah.
It's going to become more complex, isn't it? It's going to become more time-consuming, require different skills than we've had in the past.
Yeah, I think so. I think we'll see, and I think we'll always see this ebb and flow of where things widen up because there's a new technology. I mean, social was a really good example of that. When all the social platforms exploded, we saw comms explode in a very wide approach. And then as we get to know more about it and what, as you say, the data behind what each of those groups are doing on those platforms, then we start to, nuance what we're doing. And I think, over time, we will see that keep on increasing and contracting. But it's all about who we're trying to reach and what we're trying to help them do.
A great note to finish on. It's all about the audience. So fantastic. Well, thank you. And I look forward to you coming back in a few years' time, and we'll find something else to talk about. I'm sure there'll be lots going on. But Dr. Melanie BAGG, thank you so much for coming in today. Dr. Melanie BAGG, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Youth Science Forum, but also the architect of that wonderful case study there at the Academy of Science, and how the thing I love is that, everybody's on the team, thinking more broadly. Scientists who are doing work, yes, they're communicators as well, and many of them have such great skills to be able to create beautiful imagery, and using that to create an audience and an engaged audience. And 9,000 to 1 million. 9,000 to 1 million. That's just amazing. So congratulations to Dr. BAGG, and thank you to her for coming in. And thanks to you, the audience, for coming back once again. We'll be back at the same time in a couple of weeks' time. But for the moment, it's bye for now.
You've been listening to the GovComms podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes.